take our breaths away with its glow.
Whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. I'm Maria Thompson Corley. If that quote from Philippians resonated with you, stay tuned. I'd love to introduce you to intriguing, creative people whose light is making our world a lovelier place. Welcome to Finding Beauty.
Educator and arts education advocate, and draws upon these skills in her efforts to create and sustain cultural and economic development in her community. She's a founder of Creative Alberta and a founding director of the National Creativity Network, both nonprofit volunteer organizations with the objective to foster creativity and imagination within and between the multiple arenas of education, culture, and commerce. Haley has spent the past few years supporting the efforts of the National Creativity Network and its affiliates to enhance and broaden the international dialogue and develop cross-border collaborations around creativity and innovation. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to me, Haley.
Hi, Maria. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm listening to a little bit of the Chopin Winter Wind Etude that was a recording that I found of you on YouTube, and we were a big part of each other's formative years, and yet this is our first real conversation. So I know that your sister writes for the Edmonton Journal, but I really don't know much else about your family. Is it an artsy family in general?
Oh, gosh. It's funny because I do remember your family and my family sitting together, probably on opposite sides of that little room as we were in our various piano competition classes together. And I say together, but, you know, when they throw the the kids in to compete. We weren't really together, but I remember your family so vividly. And you, of course, after all these years. And really, that's something because I don't remember what I had for lunch yesterday, but I do remember those many decades ago. And actually, it's my cousin Paula who writes for the Journal, and she's doing wonderful things. My family, I like to say, is very musical. My dad wasn't a professional musician, and Paula's father wasn't a professional musician, but her father actually trained in operatic studies in Paris, studied with Poulenc in Paris for a while. And after one particularly poignant session with an instructor in Paris where she said, "Norman, your phrasing is beautiful and your diction and your clarity." And then she said, "It's too bad you don't have a voice." At that point, after all those decades and years and hours studying voice, he decided to become a lawyer. So he became a lawyer. Paula is a journalist. My dad was a teacher and then a stockbroker for many years, but he still played piano. And he played piano without ever learning how to read. So I grew up with that, my mom at the piano. I have three sisters, and my younger sister and I were the musicians. And I took the classical route, and she took everything else. And she is a professional musician today and teacher, and she plays bass and guitar and every various other instrument except the piano because, well, for obvious reasons.
Yeah, I can see what that might have been. Is she younger than you?
Yeah, she's a few years younger than I am, and we love each other dearly, but we have very different trajectories, but very similar hearts.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, do you think that maybe she stayed away from the piano because that was your realm and she wanted to establish something completely different, or do you think she really, really wasn't interested in playing the piano? I guess that's hard. I should ask her that question, not you.
Well,
maybe,
yeah, I can probably speak to that. We didn't get along as kids. Well, I don't know if it was a normal sibling relationship, but I think her anger at me manifested as I am not touching that. But of course, she's a musician at heart, and she had some associations with her bad older sister and piano. So of course, she's going to stay away from that. But she's a rock star in her own right. So
it's interesting how those things ideally, hopefully, work themselves out. Like I was talking to my sister who did play the piano and does still play and teaches piano, and younger sister, and there was again that sort of thing of being my younger sister, and even though she was also playing the piano, and she said she originally started studying something else in college because she had a sense of self-doubt based on that, and then she came around. She doesn't perform solo stuff. She does collaborative stuff, and she teaches a lot. It was interesting. She said she always loved music, but she just kind of felt this thing of being my sister, but oh well. That wasn't why I was playing. Anyway.
Yeah.
So you started when you were very young?
When we were very young, we didn't get along, yes.
Oh, I mean playing the piano.
Yeah, I think I started playing the piano when I was about 3. My older sisters played the piano, so I used to mimic them, and they hated me for it. I think I ended up playing their pieces better than they did. And, you know, it was a fine line because one day I would sit at the piano and play something, and the next day I would sit at the piano with a hairbrush and break the keys. So I didn't quite have the emotional capacity to realize the difference. I just really liked sitting at the piano.
And you decided to become a professional pianist, and when did that happen?
Well, gosh, that's an interesting question, Maria, because looking back, of course, we have that luxury now, right? Looking back, I never made a conscious decision. It was never my decision. It was a path that I was on, and it was more like, what do you call those automatic paths, those sidewalks you get on, and they're just going. And I was on one of those, and I stayed on because frankly, it was the path of least resistance. It was something I was good at, or moderately so, and until something else came along to challenge that, or something better came along, which it didn't, or I didn't recognize it if it did, I just stayed on that path. And maybe it was not so much a decision to become a professional pianist, but that I was too cowardly to do anything else. And I examined that. You know, if I had to do it again, would I do it again? And that's the way I approach it. And I still struggle with that question. So I wonder.
You never really loved it. It was just something that had just always been there. Is that kind of what you're saying? Is that you never fell in love with the idea? It just seemed like something that was going to be because it always had been, in a sense?
Yeah. It was never something I aspired to. It was something I took for granted. It was like breathing. It was like who I am at that time. It was who I was.
Yeah. So what do you think of the idea of music as a competitive sport? Because that's kind of what it was. I mean, you know, you'd scan the list of people who were going to be in a class, and, you know, I'd see your name and say, okay, got to be ready. But I never liked when I was younger, maybe I didn't hate it as much, but I always found it very stressful. I mean, as far as your development, were the competitions something that gave you something to focus on, or were they something that you just did because you felt like you had to, or how did that work?
Well, I think my answer is going to be slightly embarrassing. For me, it's a conundrum. I have to admit that that's the part of the year that I loved most. I loved those festivals. I loved competing. I loved preparing for it. And now looking back, I mean, it sounds really, really crazy. I think competition in music is something that is 100% destructive. I was young. I didn't realize what it really meant until I became an adjudicator and a teacher. And I saw my students going through the same thing. And I'll tell you an experience I had as an adjudicator when it really, really struck me how destructive. This isn't good or bad. I mean, totally soul destructive competition in music is. I was adjudicating a class of youngsters. These were kids, I would say, between 7, 8, and 9. And at that age, I wanted to find and only focus on what was good about it. And sometimes I went overboard. And at the end of the class, I would make sure to address each one of them, even though that was really something I hated when I was competing. I would hate being singled out. But I wanted to address each one of them and look them in the eye and find that one spark that was really, really brilliant and only focus on that. And I guess at one point I went overboard with one boy because the mom came up to me the next day. It took a little while, but she came up to me the next day and said, you know, when I heard you speaking to my son, I really thought you were just blowing smoke up our ass.
Oh!
and going a little bit overboard. And then he said to me, Mom, you know, I really wanted to quit piano this year, but now I want to continue.
Oh. And
I thought, that's the only reason why it should exist, is to encourage instead of pit somebody against each other. And you know, maybe that's why I feel such an affinity toward you now. It's almost like we were holding hands together in that competitive pit, and we were the only ones who really understood what was going on. And it was like throwing our fate at the foot of people who were not necessarily qualified. And I've seen too many brilliant, budding, enthusiastic musicians, like really from the heart musicians, who have been so destroyed in a competitive situation that they never do it again. And I think the only thing that comes out of that is striving for perfection. You either strive for perfection or you strive to please somebody else. And I think both of those things are deadly insofar as creating is concerned. You can ask any artist, and those are the two deadly sins, perfection and pleasing other people. And that's really the only good that comes out of it. So I could go on and on and on and on about how I think competition is evil.
I don't think you can get past a certain point in certain things unless you are a perfectionist. But perfectionism is so destructive. I mean, you have to mitigate the desire to do things really well and the crushing feeling of I'm not perfect. And so therefore I'm not as good a person because I'm not perfect. That's tough.
It is. I mean, you throw them into the pit of a competition scenario, and it's like a perfect storm then, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, wow.
Keep them out of competitions, and just it's hard. How do you coach your child to just do it for themselves? I think that's something I never had.
When I was in school, my teacher said about competitions that having sat on the juries of some of these things, a lot of times the person who plays the best, whatever, that means nothing really because it's so subjective. But he said, you know, they might vote against somebody because someone reminds somebody of their ex-wife or in a bad mood or, you know, there's just so many factors that go into those big jury competitions. And he said that the only way to be successful is to play the same music over and over and over and over and over until it's really, as you say, perfect, and then that stifles growth. So, and you have to have a certain prescribed way, or at least in that time he was saying, a prescribed way of performing things within a certain parameter. I mean, you might get some interest from people if you do things outside of the so-called accepted way, but he just felt that it was not a positive thing. He said if you are able to realize exactly what it is and not be wounded in any way if you don't do well, if you don't win, or by, you know, what happens, then it might be something for you. And some people have that kind of steely mentality, but I certainly didn't. So, you know, it was not something that was for me.
When we were growing up, we didn't have this public lens. It was just you and me in a little competition room. But these days, everybody has hundreds and thousands of people following or potentially following their every move. And it's a desire, like they actually want this, which is really, really weird. And I wonder, you know, when our girls are our ages, what their psychology is going to be like after having been watched like that. Because we weren't. It was a very private thing. We were allowed to have our own little neuroses on our own. Public observation.
Yes, big neuroses. But you know, these days anybody who plays really, really musically, I'm like, okay, What's going on? Because I feel like you have to have experienced a range of emotion to express that range of emotion. So, and it's not a bad thing necessarily, but it's just, I feel you have to have those highs and lows to communicate them. But I think you're right with this whole thing of the constant judging yourself also based on how many people liked that, and the comments on everything. And it'll be interesting to see if the pendulum, again, swings away, because the more we find out about how we are being monitored, I don't know that people necessarily accept that. Just, I have a conversation, or, I do something and suddenly this thing pops up offering me something that maybe I did a search somewhere way back when on Google for something, but even some of the friends that are suggested to me on Facebook are people that there are no mutual friends, and maybe I had like an email interaction with somebody a couple of times, and then they're being suggested as a friend, and I'm like, well, what is that? How do you know that? So, I don't know. I'm wondering if they'll start pulling into bunkers and stop. But I don't know. Again, humans are affected by the climate in which they grow up. So, I don't know if anything ever swings 100% back to something else. They may trend in certain directions, but, you can't get rid of all the stuff that happened in between, and so it's never quite the same. But I'm wondering, your daughter is an aspiring singer, and is she a songwriter as well?
Apparently she is, so she's very guarded.
Okay. But she sings, and she's not guarded about the singing anyway, or at least it doesn't seem that she is. And is your son in the arts? Is he an actor, or I'm not sure?
Well, that's a sore subject for me, because when he was young, I thought he was very artistic, and then I singularly and unilaterally ruined him when I started. bad mistake. I started teaching him piano myself and encouraging him to enter these competitions that I thought would be beneficial to him. And I'm laughing now, but I feel so bad because I think it crushed whatever artistic spirit he has. Now, he is an athlete. He's going to school in New Hampshire and was the captain of his tennis team for a while, and he decided to finish on his academic scholarship. He's finishing up this semester with an English degree. So he's found beauty in words and writing and film and communications, but not so much in music.
But he's found a way to express his artistic spirit. And I have to say, as a parent, we do the best we can. And at a certain point, it is up to our children to manage their own situations. And if we don't make mistakes, somebody else will come along and do something that will crush their dream, whether it's their first boyfriend or girlfriend or whoever that person is. So I feel that, I take my parenting very seriously, while that was one thing that I had to give myself permission not to be perfect, because, at some point, we all need a therapist, and it's just the way it goes. It's impossible. Right. But it sounds, again, like he's found a really wonderful way to do that. And for the record, I taught my daughter briefly, too, and then she learned to play the guitar. my mom was my first teacher, and her mom taught her. And there were a number of people in Leduc, where I grew up, who taught their kids piano, and maybe they all have horror stories. It's a big job.
It is. It's a really, really big job.
You do your best, and that's all you can do. So bring it.
Well, it's true, but, few men in our position, I don't know. Don't get me on my feminist rant now.
That's okay. That's okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's all good. It's
so
not
nice
good,
talking. But... Well, it's not. It's
absolutely.
Shitty. But
on that note, onward. So both of your kids are in the arts or pursuing, it seems like, things related to the arts, and you were just talking about competition, and even if you're not in a competition, you kind of are, especially as a singer, a pop singer. You know what I mean? So how do you feel about that?
Well, I have mixed feelings about that. And she's at the stage where she actually does love competing, and she has earned a lot of success through her competitions, and most particularly was on The Next Star, which was a television show in Canada on YTV. And they did very well, and they had an interesting platform, whereas the main part of the competition took place behind the scenes, and then they ended up choosing 12 singers, from which 6 went on ahead to spend 6 weeks in Toronto actually working with people and creating their art. At the end there was one winner, but I don't think the winner of the show got perceivably more than any of the other participants, and we called them participants rather than competitors. And it was really, really interesting that way. She loves competing, but hopefully I can steal her. She's had her experiences too, where she has received less than stellar comments or some potentially damaging results, but I hope I helped steal her against that, and I think that's where I can be of help, because it is a psychological game, isn't it? That whole world seems to be one of economic competition and economic advantage. So it's not necessarily who's the best singer, and really, who's to decide, right?
Yeah, and I mean, the music industry, there's so much focus on how you look. I mean, there are people who break through who aren't the conventional good looks. I mean, your daughter's very attractive in that way, but I mean, there are so many people who are cute. My thought about it was that if you really feel that you have to, then you should try, because otherwise you'll feel like you missed something, and then you can decide how much you want to deal with it, or if it rewards you or whatever. But I always say, even though it's a very difficult business and very unpredictable, that if you really, 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 really have that passion, then you should find out if that passion is true. So getting back to you, can you tell me about your time with the Hammerhead Consort and what that was?
Oh, that's old home week now. You're just taking me through my life story. I joined the group. They were already in existence, and they had released their first CD. And a friend of mine who was a student of my teacher, Ernesto Lojano, you know Ernesto from Edmonton.
Absolutely.
Corey Ham approached me and said, "Hey, do you want to join our group? It's 2 pianos, 2 percussion, and we play new music." And up to that point, I think the newest music I had played was, I don't know, maybe Bartok, who had been dead for a number of decades.
Yeah.
I thought, you mean? Yeah. And they said, of course, well, Bartok has that wonderful piece. And that was the only one I knew in existence. But what really intrigued me is that they got to commission composers to write pieces for that particular scoring. So we, as a group, were responsible for the existence, I won't say the creation, but for the existence of, I would say, at least 40 new works for 2 piano and 2 percussion. It was really cool. Some of the music was better than others, I'm going to say.
Yeah.
But it was a real change for me from being an interpreter of those long dead voices of white European males to a translator of pieces that were just newly created today. It felt like I was being part of history rather than just reflecting what had happened in the past.
I can't say I'm exhaustively dedicated to new music, although I do try to do things by people who are alive and try to do things by African-American composers and things that aren't just that canon, much as I love the stuff by dead white men from Europe. But that's one thing that sometimes you find that these things are very difficult. They're very challenging in all kinds of ways, mentally and physically, and so much concentration, and deep down maybe you don't like it so much, but I think it's such a worthwhile thing, though, to give living composers an avenue, and that's really cool that you did that. So you mentioned teaching, and I know you taught at University of Alberta, and we talked about the performing aspect of things, and now you are directing a nonprofit, and you're on the board, I see, of the National Creativity Network. So can you tell me about that, how that came to be?
Yeah, I'll try and abbreviate the story because it really is a long one, and it was a personal journey.
Mm-hmm.
When I was working with Hammerhead, and before that, there were 3 composers I felt a real affinity for, and to the point where I loved their music and I felt moved on a soul level.
Mm-hmm.
And when one of them said to me, and I was recording something at the time, and he said, well, how many more Beethoven sonatas do people need to hear?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard that before.
And I thought, okay. My answer to him was, well, one more. It's going to be mine.
Yeah.
But at that point, it's funny because a series of events happened in succession. And I just had my firstborn. I had my next child. And then, of course, my focus was on kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved that. I loved my focus being on not just my kids, but with the teaching. It really opened my eyes a lot and looking outside. And I think that's something that hadn't been afforded me before. When you're working as a solo performer, it's an inside job.
Mm-hmm.
And I never really looked around me. And then when I saw that there were kids struggling out there and struggling with everything, struggling with life, struggling with being engaged at school, struggling with family, struggling with meaning, my eyes were opened. There was a problem. I thought maybe I had an answer. Something that was missing, I knew in schools. And, when you're teaching kids, these are very often kids who come from affluent families who can afford that considerable hourly rate to send their child to a private instructor. And these were the kids I was exposed to who weren't engaged in school, who didn't find very much meaning, who weren't passionate about anything. And I looked at them and I thought, good God, if these kids aren't engaged and they're given every opportunity afforded to them, just imagine what all the other kids are like, and especially those who are more marginalized and most marginalized in our communities. And I thought, that's a crime. That's an actual crime that this is going on. It kind of spurred me into action to take a look at what was going on. At that same time, I attended a seminar with Daniel Pink speaking about left brain, right brain. I had read his book before he came, and I became a fan. And I thought, okay, all we need to do is get into the education system and change things. I know what the arts did for me. I know what the arts did for my upbringing, and I knew from personal experience how the arts, I think, literally saved my daughter. That's another conversation. But from that point, that was the meaning for me. I wanted to make sure that the kids didn't just have an art class or a music class or music lessons, this way of thinking, this creative way. And I segued from art to creativity simply because the arts were too easily segregated and axed. We think of the arts as a frill. We think of it as a luxury, something that we can afford to be without. And I think this is probably going to lead into our deeper conversation, right? And I look at it as a way of development, a human way of being, and I look at creating as the be-all, end-all, and that's what we should be striving toward in school and elsewhere. So, one thing leads to another, and I became involved with this renegade group called the National Creativity Network. I attended a conference in Oklahoma led by my friend, Creative Oklahoma, and her name is Susan McCalman. And we talked together. After that, I thought this is something that we have to do in Alberta. That's how Creative Alberta was formed. I modeled it after exactly what they were doing in Oklahoma, which was not creative. It was completely copied, but it worked for them. I thought it would work for us as well. It's amazing, the pushback. It's actually kind of astounding, the pushback that was received for creativity as a reason for education, as a rationale for education, and the economy. We're still working on it. That's kept me busy.
They have this thing with STEM, and then I see that some places it's STEAM. I've mentioned that before in another conversation, but all these things, technology, science, everything in that realm requires creativity. And I think it was an article about your creativity network or Creative Alberta that led me to reach out to you because I thought it was such a great thing that you were doing. But it just seems kind of stupid to think that creativity in various areas is not important and doesn't bleed over into absolutely everything. Who is pushing back? You mean like the curriculum, they didn't want to increase artistic things in the curriculum, or?
Well, it's funny. We still work within a curriculum that values subjects, and everything is siloed. Math is siloed, science is siloed, certainly the arts are siloed, but we don't value the product of arts as we should, and I think it's not valued because it's not recognized. And for you and me, we can say, well, of course we need creative thinking, we need creative solutions to everything in life. And we think it's obvious. If anybody's ever watched TV, if you hold an iPhone, it should be glaringly obvious, the marriage of creative thinking and science, and creative thinking and anything. And so it's breaking down the silos that became something very important for me to do. And people are very reluctant to do that. They think that there's a finite pot of knowledge, and if we're going to train our children in school, we better give them the basics like math and reading. So, okay, but the basics are simply not good enough. We don't subscribe to just finding the basics in life. Luckily, we don't live in third world countries, and if somebody said they want the basics for my children, I'm pretty sure we would rail to demand more, but yet we don't in school. When we are still talking about the subject system and based on 18th century learning, and the dead European white guy theory again, it's simply not good enough. It doesn't work anymore. It's antiquated, it's archaic, and it's not suiting us.
Well, the thing is that arts and music in particular use so many parts of your brain. Also, I was thinking when you mentioned we don't live in third world countries, but I mean in third world countries, people who have nothing will still make sure that they have some sort of, whether it's singing, as they're doing whatever they're doing. I mean, even in the most desperate situations, people will find ways to make art. I read something about this exhibition near here of Holocaust art, and people could be punished for drawing, but they would smuggle paper between their mattresses and do these things just to stay sane. So I think art is basic. But I'm preaching to the choir, I'm pretty sure, on that one. But yeah.
I wish the choir were bigger, that's all.
Well, I mean, but people expect to have music. They expect to have in your home some visual stimulation. I mean, I've never gone to a house where everything is white and there's no anything to decorate. So, I mean, these are expectations people have. They expect to be able to watch TV or movies. I don't know who they think are creating these things, but they don't want to pay for a lot of these things, perhaps, but it's integral to life. So I've noticed I see you, to change gears a little bit, going to pop concerts with your daughter. Were you always interested in popular music as well? I know when it comes to people who are schooled in the so-called classical music, we're sometimes pushed in the direction of saying good music and not so good music, but obviously you didn't buy into that.
That's such a cool question. I'll start by saying I love pop music, and I love big concert pop shows. And I could easily be a groupie and do just that. And I'd be the oldest pathetic mom sitting there, or standing, because we don't sit. Of course, we don't sit at those shows. And I love the energy, and it's something I wish classical musicians could enjoy as well. That complete audience as one with artist adoration. And, we get that, but maybe in a more conservative form where people merely just applaud politely at the end.
Yes. Well, hopefully they jump to their feet and scream and stamp their feet. But, yeah, it is a different thing. I mean, I think now they're trying to at least introduce it into more casual settings as opposed to the ivory tower idea of, the decorum. And I understand that there's some pieces that it's really hard to fully experience if you can't hear them. And, so if everybody is talking and you're playing something very quiet and introspective, of course, that doesn't work so well. Although, ideally, you quiet the room by doing that. But, yeah, I know what you mean, though. I find sometimes that it becomes more and more of this niche thing because people have made it so remote by emphasizing the fact that it's supposed to be on a higher plane and emphasizing the fact of venue and decorum and dress and all these things that I guess we're supposed to make it seem special, but now have made it seem removed from normal people and normal emotion, which I think is unfortunate because, of course, these composers had the same emotions and they were expressing those emotions just with a different language, and at least that's my thought. Anyway, but I
really
think
well
that,
said. That's good.
Yoo-hoo! Yes, 2 points. Anyway, well, I just thought that was really cool because I don't have that snobbery either. I think they're very creative people creating all kinds of music, and depending on my mood, I will want to hear well, maybe not absolutely everything, but you know what I mean. So, yeah, but I thought that was cool. So, I have a couple of standard questions I've been asking everybody. And the first one is, what comes to mind when you hear the word beauty?
I don't want to overthink that because I could. Actually, okay, I do.
Go for it.
Because, I'm allowed the subjectivity. For me, the only thing that comes to mind is peace. We don't recognize beauty if we aren't in a peaceful, receptive state. I don't. I can't. I could see the most beautiful painting or listen to the most beautiful piece of music or the most beautiful flower or whatever it is. But to me, you have to be in a receptive state. And really, beauty is everywhere. Beauty is nature. Beauty is breathing. So it's, there's a word for that, right? Pan something. Beauty is pan-existent, but you have to be awake enough to receive.
I think that's great because if everybody was more peaceful, then the world would be so much more beautiful. Even, not only incorporating the beauty into our own spirits, and I like that. Okay, so my other question, can art change the world?
That's such a good question. Can
Yay.
art change the world? Okay, well, let's dive a little deeper in that one, too.
Sure.
I'm 100% convinced, and I think we could back this up historically, that art is changed by the world. Certainly, art is always a reflection of the world in that way. But I believe that art can change people. So there is that really important, whether it changes one people or a world full of people. I don't know if size matters. I think if you change one person, sure, it can change the world. But can art change anything? And the answer is a resounding, of course. Who would dare say otherwise? But really, it's our job to change the world. And I think the danger there is actually putting a task to hand for the artist. It's not the artist's job to change the world or change anything. And God forbid they think so, because I think that could be the death of the art. However, it is the job of the artist to communicate. A friend of mine has a wonderful saying that I love to use. In time we touch, life and love will never be the same. And whether it's through art or through anything, we all have the capacity to change the world.
Great answer. I liked it. So thank you for diving deeper. Okay. So in conclusion, if people wanted to find out more about your nonprofit or even take up the baton and try to spur more creativity in their community or in their schools or wherever else, how can they find you?
That's a great question. Our website is the Alberta Creativity Network. You can find us there. Please investigate what the National Creativity Network is doing. They are a primarily American group. There are 2 Canadian directors only. There's a lot going on in the States, and you being in a straddling position in both lands can appreciate the differences and similarities. And the need for creativity. And if I'm allowed to be a little lofty in this cry, we look at creativity, the option is consumption. And we live in a very consumeristic society. Creativity is necessary for human survival. That's our bottom line. You can find us there. and National Creativity Network. Go support your senators and your congresspeople with the new CREATE Act. You'll have to look into that.
Okay.
And Tom Udall from, I think it's New Mexico, is the senator in charge spearheading the CREATE Act, which is different from the CREATE Act of 2005, which featured technological advances. This one is very interesting. I can send you more information. Support the act, write your congressperson, write your senator, and make sure you vote in the school board trustee elections. Make sure people are working for our kids the way they should, and curriculum reform, all kinds of issues. Go out and take an art class. Go out and write a poem and champion thinking creatively.
Wow, I will. And I do, I guess. And, I have one more question. That was supposed to be the last one, but do you still sit down and play the piano, or maybe you're writing poetry or drawing? I mean, how, other than spurring other people on, are you personally experiencing the arts now?
I experience the arts now, Maria, vicariously. I'm not yet satisfied with the work I've done, or I'm distracted. It's, right now, sitting down at the piano is like visiting an old boyfriend or something.
Okay.
I'm not quite ready. I'm not there yet. There are too many things in the past that we have to work through.
Okay. Yeah, I feel you. Maybe it's a little bit amicable now, but you still don't want to have lunch or get back together.
That's right. Not just yet.
I feel you.
I need some space.
Oh, I understand. Well, thank you so much for taking the time and working through the many technical difficulties that led to this conversation. I'm so grateful that we had it. Thanks, Haley Simons. I'm Maria Thompson-Corley, and this was Finding Beauty.
The theme music for Finding Beauty is Symphony of Light, written and performed by Kiana Corley, with assistance on the cello from Allegra Banks. Rusty Banks was the producer. Right now, you're listening to Liszt's Petrarch Sonnet No. 104, performed by yours truly. You can hear the rest of it on my CD, Music from the Novel Letting Go, available on CreateSpace and Amazon. If you're interested, you can check me out at mariacorley.com or mariasworld.us. You can also find me on Twitter at Maria Corley or YouTube. My recordings are available through Albany or Amazon. My novel, Letting Go, is available on Smashwords, CreateSpace, Barnes & Noble, and Amazon. Or drop me a line on my site, and I'll send you a signed copy. I want to leave you with one more quote. Do your little bit of good where you are. It's the little bits of good put together that overwhelm the world. Desmond Tutu. Have a beautiful day.